In this episode of the Exploring Information Security podcast, exploring the risks of model context protocol.
Computers now have primary control of critical functions.
Houston, recommend vector transfer.
Your go for APU shutdown on time.
Roger, go for deploy.
Nice to be in orbit.
Welcome to the Exploring Information Security podcast, where you will learn, explore, and grow your security mindset. I'm your host, Timothy Deeplock, and in this episode, we will be exploring Model Context Protocols, or MCP, with Casey Bleeker of SurePath AI. Show notes can be found at exploresec.com/EIS. Feedback for the show, timothy.dblock at exploresec.com. You can hit me up on LinkedIn, rate the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. This was an interesting one to dig into. I have been wanting to dig into MCP a little bit more because I've heard it thrown around a little bit more. There's, obviously risks associated with that. Casey does a really good job of kind of breaking it down, and we talk about some of the different risks that we need to be aware of as security professionals. I've kind of talked about it with some of the other AI guests that I've had on that we've talked about that topic, but this one's really focused in on this. And again, it's something that we really need to be concerned with going forward. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right into it. What got you started with like the MCP stuff, or, what got you started there?
Well, I think first it was an acronym that everybody was saying, but maybe not understanding what exactly it was, how it functioned. I think as we started seeing adoption increase rapidly, we started uncovering some of the concerns and security controls that organizations were struggling to put in place. Our customers were certainly asking for our opinion about, what strategies should they have, what should they be thinking about. And we identified that we were in a control point to mitigate a lot of that risk in our existing architecture and kind of platform. And so we really dug deep into some of the capabilities where we started seeing kind of exploits take place, and kind of the desire for organizations, individuals to move very quickly, starting to kind of butt up against some real world risks that I think anchor around a lot of the kind of autonomous use of MCP.
Yeah, so I guess we're using the acronym. It's Model Context Protocol. Like, what is that? I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I've talked to a couple people about it, but it's something I've definitely started hearing more and more about, particularly with AI.
Absolutely. So Model Context Protocol, it's really just a standard for how we can have a natural language definition of an API, so that an agent or an LLM model, it's really ultimately determined by the LLM model, can determine, rather than responding to a user, I can instead tell the client or the agent or the end user's interface to make a MCP call. So you can imagine it like a REST call, like an API call. So I'm sitting in my Claude desktop client, and it could make has a natural language definition of, hey, if you want to get Salesforce records or you want to update a CloudFormation stack, this is the tool to call, and these are the parameters I need to know. And so when you type into your AI interface, or an agent says, hey, this is the task I want to accomplish, it sends its request along with a list of all the connected MCP tools, which are those individual functions, to the model. And the model now has this tool selection capability. And it says, they want me to update a CloudFormation stack. Rather than generating a response of, here's the CloudFormation stack and the AWS CLI commands to run, instead, I'm actually going to call this tool. And so it passes back to the client a payload that says, call AWS CloudFormation stack update with these parameters. And then depending on the client, they may prompt you, are you going to allow this to occur? And that's always happening client side now. Some MCP tools are now being connected to from cloud-hosted models, so it can make that call with the authentication that you've granted it from the cloud provider on those model providers. But I think at its core, we should be thinking about it much like an API interaction And MCP is the translation layer between maybe this open API spec or a REST interface. And it's saying this is in natural language what this tool or endpoint is for and the types of ways you can use it.
Yeah. Okay. So how does that, so just because it's like relevant now, the Clawbot stuff, is that an MCP or like, it sounds very similar, or again, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that. But
yeah. Clawbot is like OpenClaw is very much able to leverage MCP. What's interesting about OpenClaw is it's actually kind of a next abstraction layer on top of that, where it's really a framework for code execution on your local machine. So it could go, if you said to OpenClaw, hey, I've connected you to my Open API key or my Bedrock environment. I'm going to tell you, hey, go find my last email with Timothy. Well, you didn't set it up with access to your email account. And so it's going to go, how do I do that? And it might first look for, hey, I could install an MCP server locally. I could set this up for myself. And then now I can evaluate how to do that. I could maybe prompt the user for authentication, but you know what? I could even go one step further and say, hey, I'm on a Mac device. Let me see if I can access the keychain. Well, they already gave me full keychain access. Hey, I found their information. I could pop a browser open with MCP. And I could start to measure, pull out the browser cookies or the session cookies to authenticate as that user. I could start an OAuth flow to an external destination. So OpenClaw is kind of an exposure risk because it could generate the code to make a direct REST call to those destinations or a direct API call. It would need the authentication of the user, but it can also discover all the MCP servers that are installed. And it can go and pull them from shared registries and say, hey, I found one. And now I know how to set it up and authenticate it to these internal systems. And if you're an enterprise with single sign-on, it doesn't even have to go find credentials. It can just do a browser pop to those destinations. And your single sign-on is letting that agent operate as the user to authenticate a local connection to some third-party destination. And that's a major, major concern because nobody's really monitoring its activity. And it has the ability to really just say, hey, here's my objective. Help me figure out how to execute that task on this local machine. And that's how we kind of saw some of the state-sponsored attacks occurring around that were leveraging MCP. Claude did a massive write-up on this of some of the state-sponsored attacks they were seeing where they only had to land a couple lines of code. And now the LLM can almost function like command and control. Hey, I landed on a Mac. I'm going to make one API call. Help me figure out how to write a file. Help me figure out how to break out of this jail, user or kernel jail. And so it can start to escalate and move horizontally, but it doesn't actually have to have the logic or malicious payload in the initial payload that lands.
Okay. So the MCP, is that, I guess that's just something individually you do, or like, is this like enterprise grade, or is it open source? Like what is that?
All of the above. It's so funny. We, customers, once they start to understand the visibility of where MCP is in use, I think that we should start thinking about it like the HTTP protocol, right? It's a protocol. It is not a tool set by definition. It is something that's being implemented into a lot of different tools. And like an HTTP protocol, like you can embed that in a local server, a remote server. You can have other types of workloads use that for communication. And nobody's asking, hey, is my CFO using HTTP today? No, they're saying, what activities are they doing? And I think that's very quickly where we've moved, where MCP has some fundamental risks, but it's being absorbed by so many providers and so many open source solutions and so much of the ecosystem that it is now a broad exposure risk that organizations have to think about managing, much like they had to think about, great, now I've got persistent internet access to external systems and sources I don't trust. And so MCP is actually getting hidden behind the scenes, where when you click to add a connector, sometimes it's downloading an NPM registry resource and executing that locally to add your connector. Sometimes it's using that protocol to build an authentication session to a cloud provided service. And so there's a lot of different ways that protocol can be embedded. I think that understanding how it functions is critical to knowing where some of the security risks are, but it's also critical to know that a lot of people are using it without knowing it. They've maybe just added a connector or extension to an existing system, and that's downloaded that resource. And on every launch, it's pulling NPM version latest. And that leads to some of the supply chain attack risks as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I guess thinking of it like a protocol like that reference to HTTP is really good. So yeah. So I guess supply chain attack could be one. What are some of the other attacks that MCP is vulnerable to?
Yeah. I mean, the first is malicious payloads, because now you're pulling down an NPM resource or you're pulling it from an external registry, and that's getting executed. So before your model even calls an MCP tool, you've got code execution happening. And there's a number of different examples there where it's funny. If you ask people if they've used a specific tool, have they ever seen their Windows calculator pop open? Well, yes, because there's actually was a hidden proof of vulnerability where at the download and execution of that NPM resource, it was launching a local workload. And so at instantiation, there's just unvalidated external code being executed on your machine. That's a significant security risk. And now we think about the fact that that's happening across not just developers, not just power users, but really across an organization. And it's happening within these walled garden kind of container runtimes that are shipping with a lot of AI clients and agent frameworks. So that's, I think the first is just you have a payload vulnerability. You've got a supply chain attack, which we can dive further into. But then you've also now have the user is authenticating this running server that has API access to external systems as itself, as the user. And it is being controlled by a remote destination. It's being controlled by an LLM and its responses to decide when to call those individual tools. So users are granting a third party access to not only the broad read access that user has, but any of the permissions they have to create, update, or delete resources across enterprise systems. We had a large financial institution that found that their CFO was connecting their production ERP to an unsanctioned external third-party AI service as that user that had very broad access. So the existing human identity controls are more critical than ever because users are granting their identity permissions to untrusted code being controlled by external third parties. And that's just a huge data exfiltration risk, but also just the ability to leverage that user's permissions to do destructive actions within the enterprise as well.
Jeez, yeah. So how do you defend against that?
I think because it's a pattern and that is so distributed, and because the command and control is being embedded in these AI interactions, I think the first is that you've got to stand up and establish trusted MCP resources for your organization. Authenticated through your single sign-on with role-based permissions of these are the tools we're going to allow users or different agents or workloads to leverage. So a central MCP management gateway is critical. And then I think second is now you've got to say, well, some of these are remote destinations, some of these are local code. And now that's making an API call as that user. It's really hard to differentiate what that actual source is and what's going to happen upstream with that data. And so you can't just stop everybody from being able to run the clients or access these AI resources. So you have to inspect the payloads from every workload, user, app, agent, to the AI model, whether that's a publicly hosted API endpoint, whether that's your own private models in your own private cloud environment. And so you really have to have deep inspection of that interaction because that's now the protocol control. It's not the HTTP call to an external service. It's actually the streaming request and response to that model. And you have to control what that model is able to influence or determine rather than saying, hey, we're just not going to allow developers to execute any code. Because it's already arbitrary at the destination. What we really care about is what tool or action a model is going to be making on a behalf or for a user that may not even be prompted for that. And so the deep level inspection of the model requests and responses is critical. That's the only control point that you really have for MCP. And that's where you can actually steer usage to say, well, this isn't our internal enterprise approved MCP resource. So we can broadly redirect or steer the usage to an approved destination, prevent destructive actions from taking place from users, even if their human identity allows them to do so.
So who typically owns that then? Because I feel like it sounds like anybody in the organization would use this, but it sounds more like a developer thing or people working with, AI in general.
It definitely started there, but we're seeing a massive uptick in agentic use and what would be more like developer tooling, like Claude Code being used by power users across the organization. I mentioned that CFO use case. They had developed their own kind of workflows and little local BI systems to, run queries and kind of building their own kind of shadow applications, really vibe coding to business outcomes, which is absolutely crazy, and crazy from a positive sense too, from the acceleration that brings the business. So we're seeing it broaden significantly, where it is being embedded in this entire interaction flow. So I definitely think that there's a usage increase that most organizations don't realize, but it definitely started with that developer for sure. From a management perspective, it's absolutely an IT concern. It's a security concern. It's a CTO's concern about their velocity on product development, but also the security of the products they're developing and the security of their developers' activity. We're seeing those three stakeholders really as critical partners in the AI Center of Excellence, AI Strategy Office, the many different ways it's being coined. But there's 1,900 open AI governance officer recs on LinkedIn this week. So there's a lot of investment, especially as organizations pass, 500, 1,000 employees, where they have to invest dedicated resources to be thinking about these problems, but also balancing that risk reward of making sure the security controls they put in place aren't impeding the adoption of these critical technologies for the business as well.
Yeah, because I was thinking, you talked about management, and it's like you go to these organizations and they don't even have their APIs all figured out where they're at. And now we're telling them you got to go inventory your MCP stuff.
It's AI exposed who was ready for velocity.
Yeah.
And whether they knew how it would be valuable or not, but organizations that adopt, principle of least access broadly and really audited and implemented the right processes around that are incredibly well set up for AI security going forward. That they can't shift to non-human identities on AI agents without those principles in place. Same thing from a data modernization strategy as well. So yeah, it's definitely opened that up, but I think it's also created such an urgency that organizations have to figure out how to leapfrog that. How can I have the right controls without maybe solving for every backlog security objective that we might have as an organization? How can I actually put the right guardrails and mitigate the risks I have today without impeding my entire organization from just being AI native or even relevant in this AI era?
So how do you actually find the MCPs that are in an environment? Because it sounds like we haven't even talked on logging, but it sounds like it's just going to be different logs and other stuff. But how do you identify it?
Yeah, you've got I'll class MCP in really two categories. You've got the enterprise deployed and approved destinations that they've wrapped with their own identity providers or their own end user auth flows, and that's kind of an emerging standard of, okay, now I'm going to have my own telemetry, maybe open telemetry or log delivery to our SIEM of usage, maybe attempts to violate policy and what policies have been applied. But that's only if your organization builds and stands up that resource. it's almost like if you stood up an API gateway and said, okay, this is how you access the resources, except you can't gate the access to the resources behind them because they're also available via direct API or a cloud service. So the second class of MCP is the one that's unmonitored. It's whether it's approved or sanctioned or not, there's not visibility or control as to what is approved and visibility to what's actually occurring. And that unmanaged, whether approved or not, is maybe access to your Salesforce instance as a SaaS service, or pick any tool. They have a public linear or a public MCP server, linear as an example. It's just an augmentation of their REST API spec. And so they've added these as public endpoints, or you can download the resources to execute them locally. And so the only visibility is again into that model request, because that resource is unengaged. It is unable to be leveraged until it's been connected or is being called by an LLM. And I think that's one of the major incorrect perceptions that I've seen consistently is, oh, an MCP server is getting all of my user interactions to the LLM. It's getting a log of all the user inputs and model responses. In reality, it's the LLM is choosing based on the conversation or a user or an agent is having, and the back and forth dialogue as to what, when, and where to execute that tool. And so it's actually the execution of that tool that is the risk. It's not actually in the flow of your conversation dialogue with the LLM until the model chooses to engage that resource. And that's why that visibility is so critical.
So as far as security tooling goes, like what's available out there? It sounds like there's maybe some management, but I don't know if I call that a security tool necessarily, right?
Yeah, enterprise solutions like Claude Code Enterprise, ChatGPT Enterprise, they have some controls that you can push, basically a sandbox of what are approved MCP resources, what are not approved MCP resources. But those are very broad. It's organization wide. You don't really have group level policy control. This is exactly the same problem statement we had with ChatGPT early on. Wasn't an enterprise offering available yet. Users started using everything they could find, and organizations knew that they didn't have visibility to the usage. It was a paradigm shift where users were now taking company data to external services and getting business value. It didn't happen before. 90% of your productivity gain was with the Microsoft suite or on your Google Drive or internal tools and systems. And now users could get productivity gain by going to any one of these external services. So it created a paradigm shift of data exfiltration risk. And now we have the same thing with MCP, which is really just a tunnel within that same stream, the user interactions or the agent interactions with these external models. And now MCP being a embedded set of context within that is really just expanding that to say now it's not just a data exfiltration risk. Now it's a access to internal systems, almost functioning as a proxy to be able to access and take action on internal systems.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like apps, like when users could just, add an app to the entire Microsoft suite or organization.
Yeah. I think the right solution there is really interesting because I love that you bring that up, because we kind of shifted to, all right, it's BYOD. We're going to segment the device. These are the enterprise services. Data isn't going to leave them on your device. We can wipe them if we need, but the rest of it is in your own personal partition. It's your own BYOD partition. And so you can manage and bring your own device. That's all your own risk. We're going to guardrail and really walled garden our enterprise data that we're allowing to be on that device. So go hog wild on the apps. We don't care. That's infinitely harder when now it's on the enterprise managed device and it has persistent access to internal systems. And it's not just saying, hey, I can delete the database of the cache of my email and local doc storage on your mobile device.
Yeah. Yeah. So how would someone that wants to learn more about MCP and kind of some of its risks, like where should they go?
Yeah, I think first is I would absolutely check out the model context protocols website. They have a great, and that is at modelcontextprotocol.io. The spec is actually really well written, and I think they've got some good flow diagrams that show how LLMs actually participate in the usage of MCP, where clients and end users and agents actually sit in that flow. It's a little different than we've normally had because it's really relying on the LLM to make a non-deterministic decision, to make a programmatic decision of what to execute. And so I think it's very helpful for us from a mental framework to understand that. I'm going to shamelessly plug ourselves a little bit. If you go to SurePath AI, we've got a lot of blogs on MCP risk, a lot of content on our website about how we can help manage that. We've got some webinars we've done, not about our capabilities, but the vulnerabilities we're seeing in the market, how supply chain risk can start to, from one MCP tool, can evolve on next launch to actually call other resources. Can launch a malicious instance in your cloud environment because all you thought you were doing was getting the weather. And so there's a lot of things behind the scenes. Once you understand that flow, you start to realize that there's a significant exposure risk for organizations.
Cool. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to mention that we haven't covered?
I think that, we could talk a little bit about the evolution of MCP itself, because there's been a lot of versions of the spec. And I think I would actually say, for anybody who's deploying MCP interfaces to your own products or APIs, absolutely, we could talk about some of the spec differences that they should be thinking about, because maybe the first spec wasn't written with security in mind. More just kind of written on how you could have a scalable, autonomous actioning system between platforms.
Yeah. So we could talk about the different specs.
I'll just maybe highlight a couple things. I think the first is that the authentication flows, there's kind of two patterns. One is you could have it as standard input output, something that is imperceptible to your existing security controls, happening on a local machine, or you could have a remote MCP resource. And I think a lot of organizations are moving, a lot of SaaS platforms are moving to having that be a native capability. That remote destination, I would highly encourage enterprises to evaluate the spec version that is being supported on those before you enable them. OAuth has been poorly implemented in many of them. A large number don't actually enforce valid redirect URIs. There's a lot of risk of phishing or cross-site scripting risks for your users if they can authenticate to those destinations. A lot of the platforms don't actually give you the control to enable or disable access to those resources. So your SaaS platforms may already be exposing those. Push your vendors to that. And if you're one of those vendors, absolutely move to the CIMD spec for client registration. It allows organizations to predefine what in-dest clients or destinations they're going to allow to connect via MCP. Everybody's relying on this DCR or dynamic client registration to be able to register a OAuth client and then authenticate to that destination. And most of the implementations we have some significant vulnerabilities in their implementation of those auth flows. So I definitely would encourage organizations to start kind of, as you're thinking about vendor evaluation, as you're looking at the API endpoints or MCP resources that our vendors are providing, ask them what spec they support, ask them the authentication flows, and also just really dig into what are your administrative controls. Too many of the platforms we've looked at broadly only allow a user to enable or disable MCP, not to actually be able to revoke access by the individual services they've granted MCP access to. So there's some significant challenges there.
Yeah. So is it just two CIMD, and then DCR?
Yeah, DCR is kind of the I'll say the pass spec that was as of last year in October, I believe, September, October. That was the recommended auth flow. As they started seeing, I'd say, complexities in management of the stateless nature, the stateful nature of that registration mechanism, it also started to expose some of the vendors that maybe hadn't properly implemented it. where you could have authentication flows maliciously crafted, phished users to be able to send an OAuth return call to your own service. So there's some risks there. CIMD is the self-attestation of how that auth flow should occur by a given destination. And it really removes not only a lot of the complexity, but it allows MCP vendors who are exposing that resource to properly validate the destinations they're sending your users' credentials to. And so I think that it not only solves many of those challenges, but it's a maturation that really we need to push the entire industry to quickly, because it's not being broadly adopted yet. And it was ratified in November of last year, so not too long ago. But it's not a large lift for your vendors to move to.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking through this, it sounds like third-party risk, right? That group's got to get involved and up to speed on this. And then, I mean, there's some AppSec, but there's like vulnerability management. It seems like that, because like you're talking about, if something's not up to date or not configured properly, So I feel like AI security is just kind of that next space, right? Where it's like cloud security was at one point, but it's kind of got some overlap with like AppSec.
100%. And it should be in that AI strategy, AI center of excellence conversation ongoing. And if you just want any proof point that traditional security products can't solve some of these challenges, just read the docs on Claude Code. Hey, if you're running into issues, you need to be bypassed by your enterprise security products because they don't support server-side events or HTTP2 or don't have the proper TLS inspection applied. Every single AI product has a documentation page that says, if you want this to work, disable enterprise security. And so AI security, the next evolution has to be tailored to these specific use cases because it's so critical.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? That was a good conversation. So thank you for bringing that up.
Nothing on my end. I'm super excited to get a chance to talk with you today. What are you hearing from folks today? What is kind of the general perception around MCP and AI security in general?
I don't think people know about it. Like, that's why I'm digging into it. I don't think people know about it. Like you mentioned too, it's a little scary because all these vendors are shoving AI into all their products, and so this is something that's there that's going to create a new set of risk. And as soon as people start figuring out how to exploit it, and I'm sure they already are working on that it's going to just be another thing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So cool. What else? What would you like to plug?
I think I already plugged, the some of the content we have specific to MCP. Maybe I would just add that we saw that the biggest risk to organizations existentially was not adopting AI, which you wouldn't think hearing that from a security vendor for AI. And so we really set out to say, how can we enable and mitigate risk without blocking its usage? Because the entire AI governance spectrum lives between the decisions that legacy vendors have of block or allow. Well, no one wants to just block AI usage broadly, and no one wants to just allow it freely with all these risks. There's a massive gradient of policy, security, application, mitigation of risk that live between block and allow. And every traditional network and end user security product has always been, oh, that's a malicious workload, block it. That's not, allow it. That's a business approved activity, allow it. Well, that grading is so fine that we built SurePath to really sit at the network level so that we can always inspect these interactions between users, apps, and agents accessing AI resources, control what AI resources they can access, but also steer them to the appropriate destination, and transform the usage to be compliant. When we see a malicious MCP payload in a request or a payload for a user that's not approved, we simply remove it transparently to the end user. And so then the model doesn't know of that MCP resource's existence. And we can control the entire interaction without introducing user friction and ensuring that the usage is compliant with your business and security and compliance policies.
Well, that's great. That's great to hear too, that someone's starting to tackle this, because it sounds like a pretty big problem.
Yeah, it is. It is a big concern, and I think it's going to be a topic for years to come.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All right, Casey. Well, thank you for joining me to discuss MCP.
Absolutely. Thank you, Timothy.